Well, in the late summer of 2013, I think it was, I had to do the math this week, I was getting ready to start my last year of seminary. Heather and I were living in the little town of Wilmore, Kentucky, just outside of Lexington. Heather, around that time, was having what she thought were stomach issues, some digestive issues. So I went with her to a doctor's appointment in Lexington. And in what I imagine is a routine practice with a female patient, especially a married one in her 20s, the nurse gave Heather a pregnancy test. We sat there chatting with the nurse while we waited for the results, and a moment later, the mood shifted considerably when the nurse announced that Heather was pregnant. Our reactions were very enthusiastic. We were smiling. Heather's eyes welled up with tears of joy, and as any young father would, I was dumbfounded but excited. But the next few months were, for me, a suspenseful time. All I could think about for the next few months was whether the baby was a boy or a girl. Truth be told, Heather and I had always been considering ourselves potential good girl parents. I wasn't exactly a man's man. Heather was very girly, and we weren't sure whether or not we would be good parents to a boy. Well, wouldn't you know it, when December of that year rolled around, the ultrasound revealed that our firstborn would be a little boy. 2.5 years later, we found out our second baby would be a boy as well. We'd been hoping for one of each, a boy and a girl, but I remember distinctly sitting with Heather in an ultrasound room, leaning over and telling her, we need more good men in the world. Now, I consider myself a feminist in the best sense of the word. I've endeavored to be an advocate for equality between men and women. I don't want to overstate the difference between raising girls and raising boys. I most certainly don't want to downplay the significant role of women both in the world and in the lives of young people. But neither do I want to downplay the significance of male role models in the lives of young people. Psychologists tell us that while both parents are role models for their children, children look particularly closely at their same-sex parents as their examples, girls to their mothers, boys to their fathers. Both parents shape their children, but it is mothers who show their daughters what it means to be a woman, and fathers who show their sons what it means to be a man. Furthermore, psychologists have long believed that our concept of God is in many ways derived from our relationships with our earthly fathers. Even Sigmund Freud, a man who thought religious belief was a form of psychosis, had to admit that he saw that trend as well. Clearly, the role of a father figure is very important to a child's personal and spiritual development. And during this season of Advent, I'd like to take some time to see this season through the eyes of a particular father figure. Though he did eventually have several children of his own, his very first child was not of his own blood. In fact, the woman who would become his wife had become pregnant out of wedlock and not by him. Yet he would be tasked to raise this child, and he embraced that responsibility. I'm speaking, of course, about Joseph, son of Heli, husband of Mary, stepfather of Jesus. Now, we know very little about Joseph. Only 16 verses in the Bible even mention him by name. We have to use informed imagination, or what I've heard called sanctified imagination, to fill in some of the gaps. Christians who lived over 100 years over 100 years after Jesus' earthly ministry tried to fill in the gaps. Some of them left behind writings that contain stories of Joseph from Jesus' childhood and even earlier. But they were written well after any eyewitnesses would have died, so there's no way to be certain that these stories are accurate. The only things we can be confident about are what we see in the much earlier accounts that we find in the Bible. Here's some of the things we know about Joseph. He lived in a small town called Nazareth. He was a carpenter. And though some believe he was considerably older than Mary, he was more likely in his late teens. A woman was considered ready for marriage when she could bear children, and a man was considered ready for marriage when he could make a living and support a family. Typically, young men were apprenticed in a trade, usually learning to do whatever their fathers did. Joseph was likely trained as a carpenter by his own father, Heli. Now, the word carpenter, the word translated carpenter, is the word tekton, and it specifically refers to someone who works with wood. A person who builds doors and framing for houses, who builds farm implements and furniture. The work of a carpenter, a tekton, requires patience, self-discipline, and skill. A carpenter who was accomplished enough to have other craftsmen working under him was called an architecton, which is where we get the word architect. But Joseph was not an architecton, he was just a humble tekton. A simple blue-collar craftsman just trying to make a living. When Jesus grew up and spoke at the local synagogue in his hometown, those who were offended by his teaching said this: "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? When did this man get all these things?" To these people who were offended by Jesus at the synagogue, they saw Jesus as a nobody, the son of some obscure carpenter. Now that should show you how humble Joseph's position was in society, and yet this was the man whom God chose to raise and to keep safe his son. Now again, we don't have much on Joseph, but there's one little insight we can glean from Mark's version of this same event. You see, in Mark's version, instead of calling Jesus the carpenter's son, the people at the synagogue called Jesus a carpenter. That they say this implies that when Jesus was 30 years old, he was already well known in his community as a carpenter. Joseph was a carpenter, and before he began his ministry, so was Jesus. Given the culture, it's not too far of a leap to conclude that Jesus was apprenticed by the man who raised him. Picture it, if you will. Boy Jesus in the workshop with Joseph, learning not only the carpentry trade, but probably some life lessons too. I know that I have a lot of memories of working on projects with my father or standing there while he did them. But I do remember that during some of those times, having some very meaningful conversations about life. That's what I picture passing between Joseph and Jesus in the workshop. Of course, you're probably wondering, what could Joseph have possibly taught the Son of God? Didn't Jesus already know everything? In 2006, a movie came out called The Nativity Story. It told the story of Mary and Joseph's journey to Bethlehem. Joseph in that movie is played by the actor Oscar Isaac, who, by the way, most recently has appeared as Poe Dameron in the Star Wars movies. New one coming out in a week or two. But I digress. In one scene, the two are talking by a fire, and Joseph tells Mary, "I don't know if I'll be able to teach him anything." To be sure, even as a child, Jesus knew more than most. In one account, at 12 years old, he was able to hold his own in a conversation with some scholars at the temple. That's the equivalent of a 12-year-old today holding his own in a conversation with a bunch of philosophy professors. Nevertheless, I'm inclined to believe that in order to experience full humanity, Jesus did have to learn. As an infant, he probably had to learn to sit up. As a toddler, he had to learn to walk. Jesus had to learn. When Jesus set aside his full divinity to become human, he was no longer omnipresent. We know that. He wasn't everywhere and every when. He was confined to one place and time. I believe he also surrendered his omniscience. When he demonstrated extraordinary knowledge, even about what other people were thinking, I believe he knew these things because the Holy Spirit revealed those things to him. Jesus didn't take back up his full divinity until after he rose from the dead. Therefore, Jesus did have to learn things from his parents, including Joseph, the man who served as his mentor. Is it not then likely that Jesus learned more from Joseph than just the carpentry trade? How many of Jesus' teachings might have been shaped by his apprenticeship under Joseph? After all, God had surely chosen Joseph to raise his son for a reason, and the Holy Spirit works as much through the influential people in our lives as through any other means. Who's to say that God did not use the man with whom he'd entrusted his one and only son to shape who his son would grow up to be? Adam Hamilton, who wrote the book on which this whole series is based, notes several elements from Jesus' teachings that seem like something he might have picked up from Joseph. Consider the parable of the prodigal son. If you're not familiar with that story, it's one in which a disrespectful, indulgent, and wasteful son returns to his father in shame, only to be welcomed home in a loving embrace of forgiveness. Jesus had younger brothers. Had he seen Joseph demonstrate that kind of love and forgiveness toward James or one of his other brothers? One of Jesus' biggest core teachings was that true greatness came through humble service. Did he see that sort of humble greatness growing up every day in Joseph? And some of the things Jesus says, they sound a lot like fatherly advice to me. Do to others as you would have them do to you. And what about this one? If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. I'm sure some of you could imagine your dad saying that. Certainly my grandfather, I could imagine saying that. And what about our understanding of God being shaped by our fathers? Jesus' father really was God, but he still had to learn who his true father was in the character of the man who raised him. The tenderness, the compassion, the love, the caring concern, all of those things that Jesus describes about God the Father. Did the Holy Spirit show Jesus these characteristics through the life of Joseph? I realize so much of this is speculation, but it's speculation grounded in the Bible and in what we know about that time and place. When we take what we know and use a little informed imagination to fill in the gaps, what comes into focus is a picture of a man in a sawdust-filled workshop teaching his adopted son how to work with his hands and, more importantly, what it means to be a man of God. Men and women of God alike have a responsibility to children and young people. Even if you have no children of your own, you have influence over someone. Nieces and nephews, younger colleagues and employees in the workplace, students, many of you are teachers. What sort of character do those under your influence see in you? Do they see the godly character that Jesus saw in Joseph? Because you never know how God may be working through you to raise up the next generation of spiritual leaders.